The old community hall stood quietly at the corner of a narrow street. Most people in the town passed by it every day without paying much attention. The building was not very modern. Its paint had faded with time, and the wooden doors made a soft creaking sound whenever someone pushed them open. But inside that hall was something special. Near the center of the room stood a large piano. It was old, but it still looked beautiful. Its black surface reflected the light that came through the tall windows. Many people visited the hall during the evenings. Some came to talk with friends, some came to relax after work, and others came simply because they enjoyed music. On certain days, a few talented players would sit at the piano and perform for everyone. The sound of the music often filled the room and drifted out through the open windows. Among the many people who sometimes walked into the hall was a quiet teenage boy. He was not someone people noticed easily. His clothes were simple, and he usually kept his head slightly lowered when he walked. He rarely spoke unless someone asked him something directly. Most visitors thought he was just another shy boy who liked listening to music. But there was something different about him. Whenever he entered the hall, his eyes always moved toward the piano first. It was almost as if the instrument was calling him. He would quietly sit on one of the chairs nearby and watch whoever was playing. Sometimes he stayed there for hours without saying a single word. Some people assumed he simply admired good music. Others thought he was just curious. No one really tried to ask him. What they did not know was that music meant much more to him than they could imagine. The boy had grown up in a very small home on the edge of town. Life there was simple and sometimes difficult. There were no fancy things, no expensive hobbies, and no professional music lessons. Yet inside that small home was an old electronic keyboard that barely worked. Several of its keys were slightly loose. A few made strange sounds when pressed. But to the boy it was the most valuable thing in the house. He had found the keyboard years ago when someone in the neighborhood was throwing it away. While others saw it as broken and useless, he saw something different. He carefully carried it home and spent days cleaning it and trying to fix the keys. From that moment on, the keyboard became his closest companion. At first, he did not know how to play anything. He would press random keys and listen carefully to the sounds they made. Slowly, he began to understand how different notes worked together. He watched videos whenever he had the chance and listened to recordings of great music. Night after night, while the rest of the house slept, he practiced quietly. Sometimes the music sounded rough. Sometimes the notes did not come out the way he wanted. But he never stopped trying. Every mistake became another lesson. Months turned into years. Little by little, his fingers began to move more confidently across the keys. The melodies that once seemed impossible slowly became familiar. The keyboard that others had ignored became the place where he discovered his voice. Yet almost no one in town knew about it. The boy never talked about his practice. He never tried to show off his skills. Music, to him, was something personal. It was a place where he could think, dream, and express feelings he could not easily say with words. That was why the community hall meant so much to him. The piano inside the hall was far better than his old keyboard. Whenever he heard it being played, he felt a mix of excitement and curiosity. The deep, rich sound of the piano filled the room in a way the keyboard at home never could. Still, he never dared to touch it. Each time he visited the hall, he sat quietly and listened. One evening, the hall was busier than usual. The weather outside was pleasant, and many people had come to spend time together. Laughter and conversation filled the room. A few older students from the nearby school had gathered around the piano. They were confident and energetic. One of them began playing a lively tune, and the others clapped along. The music was cheerful, and several people stopped their conversations to listen. The quiet boy walked in slowly and took his usual seat near the wall. From there, he watched the performance with great attention. His eyes followed every movement of the player's hands. Every note seemed to pull him deeper into thought. When the song ended, the group around the piano started talking and laughing loudly. They joked with each other and tried playing short pieces just for fun. The atmosphere felt relaxed and playful. After some time, the boy stood up from his chair. He did not move quickly. His steps were slow and careful, almost as if he was still deciding whether he should continue walking or turn back. The closer he came to the piano, the more nervous he felt. The instrument was only a few steps away now. He could see the polished keys clearly. The smooth black and white surface reflected the warm lights of the hall. For a moment he simply stood there. Inside his mind, many thoughts rushed together. He remembered all the long nights at home. He remembered the hours spent repeating the same melodies again and again. He remembered the dream he had quietly carried for years, the dream of playing on a real piano one day. But standing there in front of everyone was very different from practicing alone. The group of students quickly noticed him. At first, they looked at him with mild curiosity. Then a few of them exchanged amused glances. To them, he looked like someone who had wandered too close to something he did not understand. One of them leaned slightly toward his friend and whispered something. Soon, quiet chuckles began spreading through the group. The boy heard the laughter, but he tried not to react. He kept his eyes on the piano. A part of him wanted to turn around and walk away before the situation became more uncomfortable. After all, he had spent years playing only for himself. He had never performed in front of strangers. But another part of him felt something stronger. It was the same quiet determination that had kept him practicing all those nights. He took one more step forward. Now he was standing right beside the piano bench. The laughter behind him grew a little louder. Someone in the group crossed his arms and watched him with an amused smile. Another leaned back against the piano as if waiting to see what the shy boy would do next. The boy's hands felt slightly cold. Still, he did not leave. For a few seconds, the entire moment seemed to hang in the air, as if the room itself was waiting to see what would happen next. And in that quiet tension, the story that no one expected was just about to begin. The quiet tension in the hall slowly began to grow. The boy was now standing right beside the piano bench, only a few inches away from the instrument he had dreamed about for so long. The group of students around the piano watched him closely. Some leaned against the wall, others crossed their arms, and a few simply smiled in a way that showed they were not taking him seriously. A few people sitting around the hall also noticed what was happening. Their conversations became softer as their attention slowly shifted toward the small scene forming near the piano. It was not every day that someone new walked up to the instrument, especially someone who looked as unsure and quiet as this boy. For a moment, the boy did nothing. His eyes rested on the piano keys. The smooth black and white pattern looked almost familiar to him, even though he had never played this particular instrument before. In his mind, memories began to appear. He remembered the small keyboard at home, the loose keys, and the many nights when the room was dark except for a small lamp beside him. He remembered the way his fingers slowly learned to move with confidence. But now things felt very different. Practicing alone in a quiet room was one thing. Standing in front of a group of strangers who were already laughing was another. One of the older students finally broke the silence. "So, are you planning to play something?" he asked in a playful tone. The words were not exactly rude, but the way he said them made several others laugh again. Another student joined in. "Maybe he just wants to look at the piano," he joked. "It's a nice view from up close." A few more chuckles spread through the group. The boy felt the heat rising slightly in his face, but he tried to remain calm. He had faced many quiet doubts before. Every time he struggled to learn a difficult piece at home, there had been moments when he wondered if he was good enough. But those moments never stopped him from trying again. Still, standing here now, the pressure felt heavier. One of the students who had been leaning against the piano stepped forward slightly. He looked at the boy from head to toe as if trying to figure him out. "You want to try?" he said with a grin. The boy did not answer immediately. His fingers moved slightly at his sides, almost like they were remembering the feeling of the keys. More people in the hall were now watching. Some were curious. Others were simply waiting to see if the situation would become awkward or entertaining. Then another voice came from the group. This time the tone was louder, almost like someone announcing a joke to the room. "Tell you what," the student said with a playful laugh. "If you actually play something good on this piano, I'll kneel right here." The sentence was followed by loud laughter. Several people clapped jokingly as if they had just heard the funniest challenge of the evening. Someone added, "Yeah, let's see that." Another voice said, "This should be interesting." The boy stood still. The words hung in the air like a strange promise. Some people repeated them quietly, smiling as they looked at the boy. "I'll kneel if you play." It was clearly meant as a joke. To them, it was impossible that this quiet teenager could do anything impressive with the piano. His simple clothes and shy expression had already made them decide what kind of person he must be. In their minds, he was just someone who had wandered too close to a place meant for more confident performers. The boy slowly looked at the piano bench. For a brief moment, he thought about turning around. If he walked away now, the laughter would probably continue for a few seconds, and then everyone would forget about it. The evening would return to normal, and he could quietly leave the hall like he had done many times before. No embarrassment, no pressure, just silence. But another thought appeared just as quickly. He remembered the many nights when he had practiced even though no one was watching. He remembered how proud he felt when he finally played a melody correctly after struggling for days. Those small victories had always belonged only to him. Now, for the first time, there was a chance to let the music speak in front of others. The boy took a slow breath. The laughter around him began to fade slightly as people waited for his reaction. One of the students leaned toward his friend and whispered, "He's probably too scared." Another replied quietly, "Of course he is." The boy placed one hand gently on the back of the piano bench. The simple action made a few people raise their eyebrows. "Oh wait," someone said with a grin. "Maybe he really is going to try." A small circle began forming around the piano as people stepped closer. Some visitors who had been sitting far away now stood up to watch. The atmosphere had changed from casual laughter to curious anticipation. The boy slowly pulled the bench a little closer to the piano. The sound of the wooden legs moving across the floor was soft, but in the quiet room it seemed loud enough for everyone to hear. He paused again. His heart was beating faster now. Standing there, he could almost hear the echo of every practice session he had ever had. Every melody, every note, every mistake and correction seemed to gather together in his memory. Someone behind him spoke again. "Don't worry," the student who made the challenge said with a smirk. "We're not expecting a concert." More quiet laughter followed. But this time the boy did not react at all. Instead, he slowly sat down on the bench. The movement surprised several people. A few whispers moved through the crowd. "He's actually sitting down. Maybe he really does know something. Or maybe this will be a disaster." The boy adjusted his position slightly. From where he sat, the piano keys looked even more beautiful than before. The smooth surface reflected the lights above, and the entire instrument seemed to wait silently for the first note. He lifted his hands slowly. For a second, they hovered just above the keys. The room had grown almost completely quiet now. Even the students who had been laughing earlier seemed curious enough to stop talking. Everyone was watching the same thing. The quiet boy who had been underestimated only minutes earlier. His fingers moved slightly in the air as if remembering the distance between the notes. Then he gently placed them on the keys. The cool surface felt unfamiliar yet exciting under his fingertips. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. Inside his mind, the noisy room disappeared. All he could hear was the memory of music. The crowd leaned in a little closer. Some people folded their arms. Others held their breath without even realizing it. No one knew exactly what would happen next. But one thing was certain. The challenge had been made. And now the boy had decided to answer it. The boy's fingers rested lightly on the piano keys. For a few seconds he did not move them at all. The room around him felt unusually quiet. Even the students who had been laughing earlier were now watching closely, curious to see what would happen next. A few people shifted their weight from one foot to another. Someone in the back of the hall cleared their throat softly. But no one spoke. The boy slowly opened his eyes and looked down at the keys. He could feel his heart beating faster than usual. Standing in front of people had never been easy for him. At home, when he practiced on the old keyboard, there was no one watching. No one judging every note. But here things were different. He knew that many people around him were expecting him to fail. Some were still smiling, waiting for the moment he might press the wrong key or stop in embarrassment. But instead of thinking about them, he focused on the piano. The instrument felt alive under his fingers. He took a quiet breath and gently pressed the first key. A single soft note filled the air. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it was clear and steady. The sound floated across the room and settled into the quiet space where laughter had been only moments before. For a second, nothing else happened. Then his other hand moved. Another note followed the first one. Then another. Slowly, a simple melody began to form. The boy played carefully at first, almost as if he was testing the piano. Each note was placed gently, like someone stepping onto a path they had never walked before. Some of the students exchanged glances. One of them whispered, "Okay, he can press the keys." Another shrugged and said quietly, "Let's see how long that lasts." But the boy continued playing. The soft melody began to grow. His fingers started moving more comfortably across the keys. The nervous tension in his shoulders slowly faded as the familiar rhythm returned to him. For years he had practiced these movements. Now they came naturally. The notes began connecting together more smoothly. The simple melody slowly turned into something richer. His left hand added deeper tones while his right hand carried the main tune. A few people in the crowd straightened their posture. Something about the music made them listen more carefully. The boy's fingers moved a little faster now. The music started flowing like a quiet stream that was slowly gaining strength. The students who had been standing closest to the piano leaned forward slightly. One of them frowned in confusion. "This doesn't sound bad," he murmured. Another student crossed his arms and stared at the boy's hands, watching how quickly they moved between the notes. The boy himself seemed to forget where he was. As the melody continued, his mind drifted back to the many nights when he had practiced alone. The same pattern of notes, the same rhythm, the same feeling of letting the music guide his fingers. The hall slowly filled with sound. What began as a gentle tune was now growing into something more powerful. The notes rose and fell with emotion. Sometimes they moved quickly, like a sudden rush of wind. Other times they slowed down, soft and thoughtful. People who had been sitting far away in the hall began to move closer. Conversations stopped completely. One woman who had been reading near the window lowered her book and looked toward the piano with surprise. A man standing near the door took a few steps inside, drawn by the music. The boy's hands moved confidently now. He shifted from the slow introduction into a more complex part of the piece. His fingers danced across the keys, moving left and right with speed and precision. The sound of the piano filled every corner of the room. The group of students who had made the challenge were no longer laughing. Instead, they were staring at the boy with expressions that slowly changed from amusement to disbelief. "How is he doing that?" one whispered. Another shook his head slowly. "I thought he didn't even know how to play." The boy leaned slightly closer to the piano as the music continued to grow stronger. His fingers moved faster now. The melody twisted and turned, climbing higher and then dropping into deep, powerful chords. Each note connected perfectly with the next one. The rhythm was steady. The emotion in the music was clear. It was not just someone pressing keys randomly. It was someone telling a story through sound. A few people in the crowd began exchanging quiet looks. The same thought seemed to pass through their minds at the same time. They had judged him too quickly. The student who had made the joking promise earlier shifted uncomfortably where he stood. His confident smile had disappeared. Now he was watching the performance with wide eyes. The boy sitting at the piano looked completely different from the quiet person who had walked into the hall earlier. His posture was calm. His hands were steady. His focus was deep. Every movement showed that he knew exactly what he was doing. The music reached a faster section. His fingers moved rapidly across the keys, producing a lively run of notes that echoed beautifully through the hall. Someone in the crowd whispered, "This is incredible." Another person nodded slowly. The room had become completely silent except for the sound of the piano. Even the students who had mocked him earlier were now standing still, listening with full attention. The boy's face remained calm, but inside he felt something powerful. Confidence. All the practice, all the quiet dedication, all the moments when he had believed in himself even when no one else knew, those moments were now flowing through the music. The melody softened again for a moment. His hands slowed slightly, allowing the notes to breathe. The gentle sound filled the room with a feeling of warmth and emotion. Some listeners felt chills run down their arms. It was the kind of music that made people forget everything else around them. The boy opened his eyes briefly and looked at the keys again. The piano felt natural now. The nervousness he had felt earlier had completely disappeared. He was no longer the shy boy standing in front of strangers. In that moment, he was simply a musician sharing something meaningful. The next part of the piece began rising again. His hands moved quickly across the keyboard, building toward something bigger. The music grew stronger and more energetic. People in the crowd leaned forward slightly, completely absorbed in the performance. And the boy who had once been laughed at was now showing everyone something they never expected. The story of that evening was only beginning to unfold. The music continued to grow stronger inside the hall. The boy's fingers moved across the piano keys with more confidence than before. What had started as a gentle melody was now becoming something much deeper and more powerful. Every note seemed to carry emotion, and the sound filled the entire room. No one was laughing anymore. The students who had been joking earlier now stood very still. Their expressions had changed completely. Instead of amusement, their faces showed surprise and confusion. They had expected the boy to struggle or stop after a few seconds. But that was not happening. Instead, the music kept flowing. The boy leaned slightly closer to the piano, completely focused on the keys. His hands moved smoothly, as if the instrument was an old friend he had known for years. The rhythm grew faster for a moment, then slowed down again, creating a feeling that pulled everyone deeper into the performance. People around the hall moved closer without even realizing it. Someone who had been standing near the entrance slowly walked forward. A couple who had been chatting near the window stopped their conversation and turned their full attention toward the piano. Even the sound of chairs moving softly across the floor seemed quiet compared to the music. The boy's face remained calm, but inside he felt a powerful energy. All the nervousness he had felt earlier had disappeared. The moment his fingers began to play, something inside him had changed. The crowd no longer felt like a group of strangers judging him. It simply felt like music. He shifted into another section of the piece. This part was faster and more lively. His fingers traveled quickly across the keys, jumping from one side of the piano to the other. The notes rose and fell like waves, sometimes soft and emotional, sometimes bright and energetic. A quiet whisper moved through the audience. "He's really good. I didn't expect that." Another person shook their head slowly in disbelief. "How long has he been practicing?" No one had the answer. The students standing closest to the piano now watched carefully, almost studying his hands. They could see how naturally his fingers moved, how each note came at exactly the right moment. One of them leaned toward another and said quietly, "He's not guessing the notes, he knows exactly what he's doing." The boy who had made the earlier challenge felt his confidence slowly fading. He crossed his arms and stared at the floor for a moment before looking back at the piano again. The promise he had made suddenly felt less like a joke. Meanwhile, the music kept building. The boy pressed a deep chord that echoed through the hall like a strong heartbeat. The sound vibrated in the wooden walls and seemed to hang in the air for a moment before fading. Then his right hand returned to the melody. The tune became softer again, almost gentle, as if telling a quiet story. The sudden change made the audience lean in even more. The performance had a natural flow that held everyone's attention. Some listeners felt goosebumps on their arms. Others simply stood there with their mouths slightly open, amazed by what they were hearing. The boy's eyes were half closed as he played. He could feel every note through his fingers. Each key responded perfectly, and the piano's rich sound made the music feel alive. It was very different from the small keyboard at home, but somehow it felt even more inspiring. He allowed the melody to slow down for a moment. Soft notes floated gently through the hall like a quiet breeze. The peaceful sound created a moment of calm that made everyone hold their breath. Then suddenly the rhythm changed again. His fingers began moving faster than before. The music burst into a bright and energetic section that filled the room with excitement. The notes came quickly now, one after another, forming a lively pattern that echoed beautifully. Someone in the crowd whispered, "This sounds like a real concert." Another person nodded quietly. Near the piano, one of the students slowly lowered his arms. He was no longer pretending to be relaxed or confident. His full attention was locked on the performance. The boy's hands moved quickly, but they never looked rushed or messy. Every motion had control. Every sound felt intentional. The performance continued rising toward something bigger. The melody climbed higher and higher, creating a sense of anticipation. The deep notes from his left hand supported the bright melody from his right hand, giving the music both strength and balance. The entire hall felt alive with sound. People who had arrived only minutes earlier now stood in silence, unsure of how they had walked into such a powerful moment. The boy took another quiet breath while playing. His shoulders stayed relaxed. His posture remained steady. Even though the piece was becoming more difficult, he played with calm focus. Years of practice were guiding his fingers now. The music reached a dramatic section. His hands traveled quickly from one side of the piano to the other. The sound became bold and full, filling every corner of the room. The notes echoed with energy that made several people smile in amazement. The student who had made the challenge rubbed the back of his neck nervously. He remembered his words clearly now. "If you actually play something good on this piano, I'll kneel right here." At the time it had sounded funny. Now it sounded like a promise he might actually have to keep. The boy continued playing, unaware of the thoughts moving through the crowd. To him, the world had become very simple in that moment. There was the piano, there was the music, and there were the feelings flowing through each note. The melody slowed slightly again, preparing for the final part of the performance. A gentle calm returned to the hall as the boy allowed the notes to breathe. The quiet sound felt emotional and sincere, almost like a soft goodbye before the end of a beautiful story. The audience remained completely silent. Not a single laugh, not a single whisper, only the sound of the piano. And everyone in that hall now understood something they had not realized earlier. The quiet boy they had doubted was not just someone pressing keys. He was someone who truly knew how to play. The final section of the music slowly began to rise through the hall. The boy's fingers were still moving across the piano keys, but now there was a new feeling in the sound. It carried a sense that the performance was reaching its most powerful moment. Everyone in the room could feel it. The earlier laughter and whispers were completely gone. The hall had become so quiet that even the smallest sound seemed noticeable. No one wanted to break the moment. The boy leaned slightly forward as he played. His eyes stayed focused on the keys, but his mind felt calm and steady. The nervousness he had felt when he first sat down had disappeared a long time ago. Now there was only the music. His hands moved smoothly across the keyboard, producing a strong and confident melody. The notes rose higher and higher, building energy with every second. It felt like the story inside the music was finally reaching its peak. People in the audience listened closely. Some stood with their arms folded, completely absorbed in the performance. Others leaned slightly forward, their eyes fixed on the moving hands of the young player. A few people even forgot to blink. The boy who had made the earlier challenge now looked very different from before. He was no longer smiling. His expression had become serious as he watched the performance continue. Every new section of the music made it harder for him to believe what he was hearing. He glanced at the people standing around him. Many of them were nodding slightly to the rhythm. Others were quietly whispering words like, "amazing," and "incredible." It was clear that everyone in the room now respected the boy at the piano. The student swallowed nervously. The promise he had made earlier returned to his mind again. "If you actually play something good on this piano, I'll kneel right here." At the time it had sounded like a harmless joke. He never expected the moment would actually come. But now the situation was very different. Meanwhile, the music continued to grow. The boy's fingers moved quickly through a series of bright, lively notes. The melody danced across the piano, creating a joyful sound that filled the entire hall. It felt almost like sunlight pouring into a dark room. The audience listened in silence. A man near the back of the room slowly shook his head in amazement. "I can't believe we almost laughed at him," he whispered quietly. Another person standing beside him nodded. "He practiced for years. You can hear it in every note." Near the piano, the boy's hands began moving even faster. The music reached one of its most exciting moments. His left hand pressed deep, powerful chords while his right hand carried a flowing melody that seemed to glide across the keys. The sound echoed beautifully in the hall. For a moment, it felt like time itself had slowed down. Then suddenly the music softened again. The boy allowed the melody to relax, bringing the energy down gently. The powerful notes faded into something calm and emotional. It was like the ending of a long journey. The audience leaned in even closer. The quiet sound felt almost magical. The boy's fingers moved carefully through the final section. Each note was played with control and feeling. Nothing sounded rushed or uncertain. This was the part where the music spoke the most clearly. Some people in the crowd felt a strange emotion in their chest. It was the kind of feeling that appears when someone hears something truly beautiful. The student who had made the challenge now stood completely still. He looked at the floor for a moment before slowly raising his head again. The sound of the piano had changed something inside him. The boy at the piano pressed another soft chord. The note echoed gently through the room and slowly faded. Then came the final movement. His fingers glided across the keys one last time, creating a graceful run of notes that sparkled like falling raindrops. The melody rose gently and then slowly settled back down. And finally, he pressed the last chord. The sound was strong but peaceful. It hung in the air for a moment before slowly disappearing. Silence filled the hall. For a few seconds, no one moved. It was the kind of silence that comes after something truly special. People looked at each other as if they needed a moment to understand what they had just experienced. The boy slowly lifted his hands from the piano keys. His fingers rested in the air for a second before he lowered them into his lap. He took a quiet breath and looked down at the instrument. The performance was over. Then suddenly the silence broke. A loud burst of applause filled the hall. People clapped with excitement and admiration. Some even cheered softly. The sound of appreciation echoed across the room just as strongly as the music had moments earlier. The boy looked slightly surprised. He had spent so many years playing alone that hearing applause felt strange and wonderful at the same time. Several people stepped closer to the piano, smiling and shaking their heads in amazement. "That was beautiful," someone said. "I've never heard anyone play like that here before," another voice added. But as the applause continued, many eyes slowly turned toward the student who had made the challenge earlier. He noticed it immediately. At first he tried to pretend he didn't understand why everyone was looking at him. But the memory of his own words made it impossible to ignore. The promise had been clear, and the boy had done exactly what the challenge demanded. The student took a slow breath. Then, with a slightly embarrassed smile, he stepped forward. The crowd watched quietly as he walked toward the piano. The young musician looked up with a calm expression, unsure what the student was about to do. The student stopped in front of him. For a brief moment he hesitated. Then, remembering his promise, he slowly bent down and placed one knee on the floor. A surprised murmur spread through the crowd. Some people laughed softly, but this time it was not mocking laughter. It was the laughter of amazement and respect. The student looked up at the boy and shook his head with a small smile. "You proved us wrong," he admitted honestly. The boy sitting at the piano did not say much. He simply smiled quietly, because in that moment, the music had already said everything that needed to be said. The applause in the hall continued for several moments. People clapped with genuine excitement, and the sound filled the room just as strongly as the music had earlier. Some people even stood up from their chairs while clapping, unable to hide how impressed they were. The boy remained seated at the piano bench for a moment. His hands rested quietly in his lap while he listened to the applause. He looked a little surprised by all the attention. For years he had practiced alone in his small room, with no audience and no applause. Hearing so many people react to his music felt almost unreal. Slowly he stood up from the bench. The crowd continued clapping as he stepped slightly away from the piano. A few people nearby smiled warmly at him. Some nodded with admiration as if they wanted to thank him for the beautiful performance. The student who had knelt earlier stood up as well. His earlier confidence had been replaced by something more honest. There was a respectful look on his face now. He brushed the dust from his knee and gave a small laugh. "I guess I should be careful with my promises," he said. A few people nearby chuckled softly, but this time the laughter was friendly. The moment no longer felt like a joke. It felt like a lesson everyone had just witnessed. The boy simply gave a quiet smile. He did not look proud or arrogant. Instead, he seemed calm and humble, as if the music had been the most natural thing in the world. Several people began stepping closer to him. One older man shook his head in amazement. "That was beautiful," he said sincerely. "How long have you been playing?" The boy hesitated for a moment before answering. "For a few years," he replied softly. Another person asked, "Did someone teach you?" The boy shook his head gently. "No, I just practiced a lot at home." The people around him looked even more surprised. "Wait, you taught yourself?" someone asked. He nodded. There was a brief silence as people processed that information. It made the performance feel even more impressive. One woman placed her hand over her heart as she spoke. "You must have worked very hard." The boy looked down slightly and gave a small nod. He remembered all the nights when he practiced quietly while the rest of the house slept. He remembered repeating difficult sections of music again and again until his fingers finally understood them. Those memories felt personal, but hearing people appreciate the result made all that effort feel meaningful. Meanwhile, more visitors from other parts of the hall began walking over to the piano area. Word about the performance had spread quickly through the building. "What happened here?" someone asked. "You missed it," another person replied. "This young player just gave the most amazing performance." The group of students who had been joking earlier now stood quietly among the crowd. Their expressions had changed completely. Some of them even looked a little embarrassed when they remembered how they had laughed at the boy earlier. One of them finally stepped forward. "I'm sorry we laughed," he said honestly. "We didn't know you could play like that." The boy looked at him for a moment and then gave a small, understanding smile. "It's okay," he said simply. His calm response surprised them. He was not angry. He was not trying to prove a point. For him, the music had already spoken clearly enough. A gentle conversation began forming around the piano. People asked him questions about music, about how he practiced, and about what kind of songs he liked to play. The boy answered politely, though he kept his words simple. He was not used to being the center of attention. One older woman looked at the piano and then back at him. "You should come here more often," she said kindly. "This hall needs music like yours." The boy looked at the instrument again. For years he had only dreamed about playing a real piano like this one. Now that he had done it, the experience felt both exciting and peaceful at the same time. "I would like that," he said quietly. The student who had made the challenge earlier crossed his arms thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "when you walked in, I thought you were just another quiet kid who liked watching." He shook his head with a smile. "I was very wrong." A few others nodded in agreement. Sometimes people judge others too quickly. They see someone quiet or simple and assume there is nothing special about them. But that evening had shown everyone something important. Talent does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it appears quietly, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The boy slowly walked back toward the piano and gently touched one of the keys again. A soft note echoed through the hall. This time the sound felt different. It no longer carried pressure or doubt. Instead, it carried confidence and possibility. People watched him with new respect. The same person who had been ignored earlier was now someone everyone wanted to hear again. The evening slowly continued, But the story of what happened in that hall spread quickly among the visitors. Many people would later tell others about the quiet boy who surprised everyone with his music. Some described how the room had gone silent when he began to play. Others talked about the moment when the joking promise turned into a real one. But the most important part of the story was simple. The boy had believed in himself even when no one else expected anything from him. And when the moment came, he let his hard work speak through music. As the crowd slowly returned to their conversations, a few people still stayed near the piano, hoping to hear another melody. The boy sat down again, this time with a calm smile. He placed his fingers gently on the keys, and as the first soft notes of another song began to fill the hall, everyone nearby listened with the same quiet respect, because now they knew something they had not understood earlier. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one with the most powerful story to tell.